On the 19th of December 1944, in a cold stone barracks in the French city of Verdun, General George S. Patton looked across a wooden table at the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. He said one short sentence, a handful of words. About 3 divisions, about 48 hours. Dwight Eisenhower stared at him in silence. One British officer in that room would later call the pause the longest 10 seconds of his career. Some of the American generals present thought Patton had lost his mind. Others thought he was posturing. None of them yet understood what had just happened. Because that short sentence, spoken calmly by a 59-year-old man in a lacquered helmet and ivory-handled revolvers, had already begun to save the lives of 20,000 American soldiers, freezing in the snow of a small Belgian town at the crossroads of 7 roads. A town most of the men in that room could not yet find on a map, a town called Bastogne. This is the story of how it happened, of the 4 impossible words that changed the war in the West, of the promise made between 2 old friends who had known each other since 1919, and of the winter that broke the last army of the Third Reich. Bastogne, December 22, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. The temperature is 5 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit. With the wind it feels like 10 below. Snow has been falling for 3 days without pause, and the small Belgian town at the crossroads of 7 roads has become a frozen island in a sea of German steel. 4 men in grey-green Wehrmacht uniforms walk down a country lane toward the American perimeter. A white flag hangs from a stick in the lead officer's hand. They carry a folded document, typed on official paper, sealed with the eagle of the Reich. It is a demand for surrender. It is polite, it is precise. It gives the American commander 2 hours to decide whether the 20,000 men trapped inside Bastogne will live or die. The message reaches the underground command post of the 1st Airborne Division. It reaches a desk lit by a single bulb powered by a groaning generator. Behind that desk sits a 46-year-old artillery officer with tired eyes and a 5-day beard. His name is Anthony Clement McAuliffe, and he is only in command by accident. The division's real chief, Maxwell Taylor, is in Washington attending a conference. Fate has left McAuliffe in charge of one of the most desperate positions in American military history. He reads the German ultimatum. He reads it a second time. Then he mutters a single word under his breath. A word he grew up saying in Washington, D.C., a word so ordinary it means almost nothing. Nuts. His staff officers look at each other. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, leans forward and says the sentence that will echo through the rest of the 20th century. Sir, that's about as good a reply as any. McAuliffe writes it down. 1 word. All capital letters. Nuts. The German envoys, when they receive the reply an hour later, do not understand. They ask in careful English what it means. An American officer looks them in the eye and says quietly, "It means go to hell." But to understand how 20,000 American soldiers ended up trapped in a Belgian crossroads town in the coldest winter in 40 years, to understand how a single word became legend and how a promise made 3 days earlier had already begun to save them, we have to go back. The story has been retold many ways in the 80 years since. Some versions describe a phone call, some describe Eisenhower breaking down in tears. The truth, as the historical record preserves it, is simpler than either legend, and in its own quiet way, more haunting than both. Back before the snow, back before the encirclement. Back to a moment when the Allied High Command believed the war in Europe was almost won. Late autumn 1944. The map of Western Europe looks like a promise fulfilled. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. American armor has rolled across France. British and Canadian troops have pushed into the Low Countries. In the east, the Red Army stands at the gates of Warsaw. Newspapers in New York and London speak openly of Christmas at home, of victory before spring. But behind the headlines, the war has begun to slow. And the reason is not German resistance. It is fuel. Every Allied army in Europe is running on gasoline shipped from ports hundreds of miles behind the front. The great harbour of Antwerp, the largest deep-water port in northern Europe, was captured intact in September. But the Germans held the estuary of the Scheldt River, and until that estuary was cleared, no Allied ship could reach the docks. It took 2 months of bitter fighting in the mud of the Netherlands to open the passage. The first Allied convoy did not enter Antwerp until the 28th of November. And by then the front line stretched nearly 400 miles, from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and it was thinly held everywhere. Nowhere thinner than a densely forested plateau on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, a region of steep valleys, narrow roads and towering pines. A place with a name that will soon be spoken in every American home, the Ardennes. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, in the ornate Palace of Versailles outside Paris, one man carries the weight of it all. He is 54 years old, he is tall, he is balding, he has a Kansas farm boy's steady grin and a general's tired eyes. His name is Dwight David Eisenhower, and he commands 3 million men. Eisenhower is not a battlefield commander, he is a coalition builder. His job is to keep Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery of Britain and General Omar Bradley of the United States from tearing each other apart in the newspapers. His job is to keep Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt reading from the same script. His job is to smile through disputes over supplies, glory, and strategy, and to make the great machine of alliance keep turning. He has not slept well in weeks. He smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day. 80 miles to the east, in the medieval city of Luxembourg, sits the commander of the 12th Army Group. 51-year-old Omar Nelson Bradley is often called the GI's general. His round face, his soft voice, his rimless glasses, everything about him suggests a schoolteacher rather than a warlord. Bradley commands more American soldiers in combat than any other man in history. He is careful, he is methodical, he does not like risk. And in early December of 1944, he believes the Ardennes sector is quiet. 120 miles further southeast, in the French city of Nancy, sits the third man in this triangle. His headquarters smells of coffee and cigar smoke. He is 59 years old. He wears a lacquered helmet, an ivory-handled revolver on each hip, and boots polished to a mirror shine. He has read Caesar and Rommel in the original. He believes he is the reincarnation of a Roman legionary. He believes he is a soldier of destiny. His name is George Smith Patton Jr., and he is in disgrace. Just 16 months earlier, in August of 1943, on the island of Sicily, Patton had walked into 2 military field hospitals and slapped 2 American soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. He called them cowards. He threatened one of them with his revolver. When the story reached the American press, it became a national scandal. Eisenhower nearly relieved him of command. Then, in April of 1944, at a small gathering in the English town of Knutsford, Patton made a speech that seemed to leave Russia out of the post-war order. The newspapers howled again. He was reprimanded again. Marshall in Washington considered sending him home. Instead, Eisenhower gave him the Third Army. A gift, but also a warning. One more mistake and it would end. Patton knows this. Patton has spent the autumn of 1944 proving himself with a fury bordering on obsession. His Third Army has driven across France at a speed no other Allied commander has matched. He is now attacking eastward, toward the Saar industrial region, toward the German heartland. His mind is set on the Rhine. But there is one man on his staff who is not looking east. There is one man looking north. His name is Colonel Oscar Koch. He is 47 years old. He is a career intelligence officer. He is quiet, methodical, deeply respected. He runs the intelligence section of the Third Army, the G2, and in the first week of December, Koch begins to notice patterns. Radio intercepts show German armored units moving west. Reconnaissance photographs show fresh rail traffic behind the front. Prisoner interrogations mention unfamiliar unit designations. Koch cannot prove anything, but he sees the shape of something forming in the fog behind the German lines. On the 9th of December, he walks into Patton's office with a briefing folder and lays out his conclusion. The Germans are massing armor somewhere in the north. The Ardennes sector is a possible axis of attack. Patton listens. Patton does not laugh. Patton does something almost no other Allied commander does in that month. He believes him. He does not stop his own offensive. But he tells his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, to prepare quietly. 3 contingency plans, 3 sets of movement orders. 3 possible directions to pivot the Third Army if the Germans strike in the north. Each plan is assigned a color code, so that if the moment comes, Patton can telephone his headquarters with a single word and set an entire army in motion. No one at Supreme Headquarters knows he has done this. And here is the first bitter twist of this story, the twist that history has almost forgotten. Oscar Koch was not the only intelligence officer sounding the alarm. At Schaff itself, the chief of intelligence, a 44-year-old Scotsman named Major General Kenneth Strong, had come to a similar conclusion. Strong warned Bradley in person. He suggested that the Ardennes was dangerously thin. He recommended reinforcement. Bradley waved it off. The Ardennes, he said, was a poor route for tanks. The Germans, he said, were too weakened for a strategic offensive. And besides, if they did attack, the Americans could pull them into a trap. Eisenhower did not overrule him. 2 warnings. 2 intelligence officers. 2 men who had done their job, and both were ignored by the men above them. Meanwhile, in a hidden headquarters in the mountains of central Germany, another commander was preparing his own gamble. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was 55 years old. His hands trembled. He walked with a stoop. His inner circle had begun to notice that he sometimes lost the thread of a briefing. But his will remained iron, and in the autumn of 1944 he had constructed a plan he believed could still save the Reich. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The concept was audacious. 3 German armies would burst out of the Ardennes forest, exactly as they had done in 1940 when they defeated France in 6 weeks. They would smash through the thin American line, race across Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp within a week. They would split the American and British forces. They would force a negotiated peace in the West. Then they would turn everything east against the Soviets. His senior commanders looked at the plan and were horrified. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, 69 years old, aristocratic, exhausted, the senior soldier of the German army, called it impossible. The distances were too great. The fuel, the armor, was too worn. Field Marshal Walther Model, 53 years old, small, bespectacled, ferocious, and known as the Führer's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. Model told Hitler bluntly that the plan had no chance. He proposed a smaller, more realistic offensive. Hitler refused. The plan would be executed as ordered, and here comes the second twist, a detail that turns the whole story from military history into something closer to fate. Hitler did not choose the date at random. He personally studied the meteorological forecasts. He waited for a specific weather pattern, a stretch of 10 to 14 days of low cloud, fog, and freezing rain over Western Europe. Weather that would ground the Allied air forces. Weather that would blind Allied reconnaissance. Weather that would neutralize the single greatest Allied advantage on the continent, air power. When the meteorologists at his headquarters told him that such a pattern was forming over the Ardennes on the 16th of December, Hitler set the day. 3 German armies moved into position under cover of darkness. The 6th SS Panzer Army under General Sepp Dietrich, 52 years old, a hardened SS commander loyal to Hitler since the beer halls of Munich, would strike in the north. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, 47 years old, small, sharp-eyed, a professional soldier of the old school, would strike in the center. The 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger would guard the southern flank. In total, nearly 250,000 German soldiers, more than 1,000 armored vehicles, and 1,900 artillery pieces gathered in the frozen forests west of the Rhine. Not a single word of this reached the American troops in the line. Those troops were mostly boys. In the sector opposite the German 5th Panzer Army stood the 106th Infantry Division. The 106th had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. The average age of its riflemen was 22. They had never seen combat. They had been placed in what everyone believed was a quiet sector to gain experience. They were spread thin, holding a front longer than any division was ever supposed to hold. North of them, the 28th Infantry Division was recovering from the meat grinder of the Hürtgen Forest. Some of its companies were down to half strength. To the south, elements of the 4th Infantry Division held ground where the tree cover was so thick that men could not see 50 yards in any direction. They were tired, they were cold. Many of them were writing letters home about Christmas. Then, at 5:30 in the morning on Saturday the 16th of December, 1944, the world tore open. The German artillery bombardment lasted 80 minutes. It came without warning. Along a front of 80 miles, thousands of guns fired in coordinated waves. In the American foxholes, men who had been asleep in blankets and greatcoats were flung awake by explosions that shredded the treetops above them. Splinters of pine rained down like knives. Communication wires were cut. Field telephones went dead. Whole platoons vanished in flashes of red and orange. Then came the searchlights. The Germans had positioned anti-aircraft searchlights behind their front lines. They aimed the beams at low cloud and created what they called artificial moonlight, an eerie silver glow that lit the snowscape and blinded the defenders. Under that glow, tens of thousands of German infantrymen advanced. Behind them came the tanks, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, a tide of steel rolling out of the fog. The 106th Infantry Division held for less than 72 hours. On the ridge of the Schnee Eifel, two of its regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were surrounded. Their radios failed, their ammunition ran low, their trucks slid off the icy trails. For 2 days their officers tried to organize a breakout. For 2 days the men fought in scattered pockets, in the snow, in the trees, and on the 19th of December, without food, without hope of relief, more than 7,000 American soldiers laid down their weapons and marched into German captivity. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater of World War II. It was the second largest in American military history after Bastogne in 1942. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the news arrived in fragments. Reports contradicted each other. Some officers refused to believe the scale of the disaster. Eisenhower stared at the maps as the red arrows pushed deeper and deeper into the American lines. A bulge was forming. A great ugly bulge, 40 miles wide and growing. In Luxembourg, Omar Bradley looked at the same maps and said at first that it was only a local counterattack. In Nancy, George Patton read the situation reports and said nothing to his staff. He walked to a map on the wall. He looked at the sector around Bastogne. He measured the distance with his eye. Then he picked up the telephone in his private office and spoke a few short sentences to Hobart Gay. One of the 3 color-coded plans was now active. The Third Army had begun silently to prepare its turn. None of them knew it yet. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not the freezing paratroopers about to be rushed into a Belgian crossroads town. But the shape of the next month of the war had already been drawn. It would be written in snow and in blood and in a phrase muttered by a tired artillery general. Nuts. But before that word could echo through history, 20,000 men had to be surrounded first. And a single impossible promise would have to be made in a cold French barracks room by a man with ivory-handled revolvers to the supreme commander of the Allied forces. That promise is where our story turns. The 17th of December 1944, a cold grey dawn over eastern Belgium. The German offensive is now 30 hours old, and the American front is coming apart in ways no one in Versailles yet understands. But somewhere behind the lines, in the wreckage of retreating convoys and burning half-tracks, a different kind of war has begun. A war fought in stolen uniforms, a war fought with lies. His name is Otto Skorzeny. He is 36 years old. He is tall, scarred across the left cheek from a student duel in Vienna, and he is the most famous commando in the Third Reich. In September of 1943 he had landed by glider on a mountaintop in Italy and personally rescued Benito Mussolini from Allied captivity. Hitler considers him a genius of unconventional warfare, and in October of 1944 Hitler had summoned him to a private meeting and given him a mission unlike anything in modern military history. The operation was called Greif. In German, the word means the mythical griffin. Skorzeny was to raise a special brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, put them in captured American jeeps, and infiltrate them behind the American lines during the coming offensive. Their job was to seize bridges, to turn road signs, to spread false orders, to create confusion, to break the American command structure from the inside. The reality proved smaller than the myth. Skorzeny raised roughly 2,500 men for Panzer Brigade 150, but only a handful spoke fluent enough English to pass an American checkpoint. In the end, only about 150 were formed into the true commando teams, a unit designated Einheit Stielau. On the night of the 16th of December, small groups of these men crossed the shifting front line in their stolen jeeps, wearing American field jackets over German wool. Most of them never accomplished their missions. But they did not need to, because within 24 hours, rumors began racing through the American rear echelon. Rumors that German assassins were roaming behind the lines. Rumors that Skorzeny himself was leading a raid on Paris to kill General Eisenhower. American military police began stopping every officer at every crossroads, demanding trivia questions to prove their identity. What is the capital of Illinois? Who plays second base for the Chicago Cubs? Who is Betty Grable married to? One American brigadier general was held for hours because he could not remember the correct answer. At Versailles, the security detail around Eisenhower was tripled. He was moved to a smaller villa. Barbed wire was strung across the driveway. Guards patrolled the halls at night. Eisenhower himself was furious. He continued to work. He continued to sign orders. But for several days, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force could not walk out of his own front door without an armed escort. Fear was doing the work of 1,000 commandos. And then came Malmedy. Late on the morning of the 17th of December, a column of American vehicles was moving south through the Belgian crossroads at Bastogne, near the town of Malmedy. Most of them belonged to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. These were not front-line combat troops. They were survey specialists, men with maps and calculators. Their average age was in the mid-20s. Many were draftees from small towns in the American Midwest. They rounded a curve in the road and drove directly into the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Piper. The commander of that formation was Joachim Piper. He was 29 years old. He was blond, handsome, ruthlessly ambitious, and he had come of age in the Waffen-SS. He had served as an adjutant to Heinrich Himmler. He had fought on the Eastern Front and had earned a reputation for brutal efficiency. His battle group, built around the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was the spearhead of the entire German offensive in the north. His orders were simple: move fast, do not stop, reach the Meuse River. Prisoners were an inconvenience. The Americans at Bastogne surrendered without a serious fight. They were disarmed. They were marched into a snow-covered field beside the road. Roughly 120 men stood together in the cold, hands raised, waiting to be taken to the rear. Then a German officer in one of the half-tracks drew his pistol and fired into the crowd. Within seconds, machine guns opened fire from the vehicles. The Americans fell in waves. Some tried to run for the tree line. They were cut down. Others played dead in the snow, listening as German soldiers walked among the bodies and shot the wounded. When it was over, 84 American prisoners of war lay dead in that field near Malmedy. A handful survived by lying still under the corpses of their friends. That night, some of them crawled through the woods and reached American lines. By the 18th of December, the news of the massacre was moving through the American army at the speed of radio. Officers read it aloud to their men. In the days that followed, in unit after unit, the response was the same. A quiet, hardening rage. American soldiers who had been ready to accept German surrenders became, in many sectors, unwilling to take prisoners at all. The war in the Ardennes became a war without quarter. For the ordinary German soldier caught in that fight, the Volksgrenadier drafted 3 months earlier, the boy in a Wehrmacht uniform who had never heard of paper, the price of Malmedy would be paid in blood for weeks to come. While that horror was still unfolding, 40 miles to the west, an American division was being pulled from its rest camp and thrown into history. The 101st Airborne Division had jumped into Normandy on the 6th of June, into Holland on the 17th of September, and had lost more than 4,000 men between those two operations. In early December, the division had finally been sent to the French town of Mourmelon-le-Grand to refit. New replacements were arriving. Christmas mail was arriving. Men were sleeping in real beds for the first time in half a year. The division's commanding general, Major General Maxwell Taylor, 43 years old, was in Washington, D.C., attending a conference on airborne doctrine. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. Command of the division fell, temporarily, to a man who had never held it before. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, 46 years old, the division's artillery chief. McAuliffe was not a paratrooper, he was a gunner. He was a West Point graduate from Washington, D.C., the son of an army officer. He was thin, alert, plain-spoken, and known for extraordinary calm under pressure. On the evening of the 17th of December, McAuliffe received orders that his division would move north by truck within 24 hours. Destination: a small Belgian crossroads town he had barely heard of, Bastogne. The paratroopers loaded onto flatbed trucks in freezing rain. Many of them had no winter overcoats, many had no helmets. Weapons were pulled from division stores and thrown into the trucks with the men. Ammunition was distributed on the road. Some soldiers scavenged rifles from wounded men they passed at the field hospitals. The trucks drove through the night, headlights blazing, because there was no time for blackout discipline. They arrived at Bastogne on the morning of the 19th of December, walking past streams of retreating American vehicles going the other way. Some of the fleeing soldiers threw ammunition out of their trucks to the paratroopers, wordlessly, as if leaving gifts for men they would not see again. One paratrooper reportedly looked up at a passing tank crew and said, "Are those Krauts really coming? Well then, we've got them right where we want them." By the 20th of December, Bastogne was surrounded on 3 sides. By the 21st, it was surrounded completely. The town itself was small. Perhaps 3,000 civilians in peacetime. But it sat at the meeting point of 7 paved roads, the only major hub through which German armor could move west across the wooded plateau. Manteuffel understood its value. He detached the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the Panzer-Lehr Division to reduce the town. His main forces pushed on toward the Meuse. He believed Bastogne would fall within a day or two, cut off from supply, without air cover in the deepening cold. Inside the ring, McAuliffe organized his defense in a rough circle around the town, roughly 11,000 paratroopers of the 101st. Elements of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B under Colonel William Roberts. Detachments from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Stragglers from a dozen shattered units absorbed on the spot. All told, close to 18,000 American soldiers and airmen inside a perimeter roughly 16 miles around. They had roughly 10 rounds of artillery ammunition per gun per day. They had 1 field hospital, and the Germans overran it on the 20th of December, capturing most of the division's surgeons and medical supplies. They had no way to evacuate the wounded. They had no air support because the sky was locked under solid grey cloud. They had no plan except to hold. And now the story turns to a moment that has been argued about in memoirs and command histories for 80 years. Because on the same day that McAuliffe's perimeter closed around Bastogne, Dwight Eisenhower made a decision at Supreme Headquarters that would shake the Anglo-American alliance to its foundation. On the 20th of December, Eisenhower picked up a telephone in Versailles and made 2 calls. The first was to Omar Bradley in Luxembourg. The second was to Bernard Montgomery in the north. He told Bradley that, effective immediately, the American First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the American Ninth Army under General William Simpson, both operating on the northern shoulder of the German Bulge, were being transferred out of Bradley's command and placed under Montgomery. Bradley would retain the American Third Army under Patton on the southern shoulder. The line of communication between the 2 American halves of the Bulge had been cut. Montgomery was the closest Army Group commander in physical position to organize the North. It was, Eisenhower believed, a purely operational decision. To Bradley, it was a knife to the heart. Bradley had never trusted Montgomery. He considered the Field Marshal arrogant, self-promoting and slow. He believed that handing American troops to a British commander in the middle of an American crisis was a public humiliation. In his memoirs, written years later, Bradley admitted that he came close to resigning in the days that followed. He told Eisenhower, in a voice friends had never heard from him before, that if the order stood he might have to resign his commission. Eisenhower, exhausted, told him quietly that if his subordinates threatened resignation over his orders, then he had best find new subordinates. The order stood. 2 American armies passed into Montgomery's command that night. In the north, the change probably stabilized a chaotic situation. Montgomery moved quickly, imposed order, positioned reserves, prepared his lines. But politically, the decision would poison the top of the Allied command structure for the rest of the war and for decades after. While all of this was happening, another meeting had already occurred. A meeting that would decide, more than any other single event, whether Bastogne would live or die. It took place on the 19th of December at 11 in the morning in a cold stone barracks in Verdun, France. Verdun, of all places. The name itself an echo of another war, another generation, another catastrophe. Around the table sat Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, General Jacob Devers of the 6th Army Group, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder of the Royal Air Force, and Kenneth Strong of Chef Intelligence. There was a coal stove in the room. The men wore their overcoats. Their breath clouded the air when they spoke. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a sentence that has been quoted in one form or another in nearly every history of the battle. He said quietly and without drama, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." The men around the table nodded, they looked at their maps, they discussed the German penetration. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. He asked how quickly the Third Army could disengage from its current attack in the Saar, wheel 90 degrees to the north, march roughly 100 miles over frozen roads, and strike into the southern flank of the German Bulge. The other generals in the room had already estimated the answer among themselves: a week, maybe 10 days. Anything faster was fantasy. Patton looked at Eisenhower. He did not consult his aides. He did not open a folder. He said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. One British officer would later describe the pause as the longest 10 seconds of his career. Some of the American generals thought Patton was posturing. Some thought he had lost his mind. Eisenhower stared at him for a long moment. According to Patton's own account, written after the war, the Supreme Commander said, "Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll get a bloody nose." Patton did not flinch. He said he understood the risk. He said the movement had already begun. Because here is what the men in that room did not fully appreciate. In the days before Verdun, according to Colonel Koch's later memoir, Patton had quietly instructed his staff to prepare the movement. Hobart Gay had been briefed. Route planners had drawn the maps. Supply officers had been warned. The formal orders would not go out until Eisenhower gave his approval. But the machinery of 133,000 vehicles was already, in the minds of the men who would run it, beginning to turn. Patton was not making a boast. He was reporting a preparation his commander did not yet know he had made. Eisenhower, still weighing it, finally nodded. He gave the order. The counterattack would go. That evening, as Patton drove back to his headquarters through the snowy French countryside, he told his aide, in a low voice, that the meeting at Verdun had been the greatest hour of his life. What followed over the next 72 hours has been called, by more than one historian, the most impressive feat of operational movement in the history of the United States Army. In 72 hours, roughly 133,000 vehicles moved north through a maze of narrow, ice-covered Belgian and French roads. They moved 62,000 tons of supplies. They moved 3 full divisions, the 4th Armoured under Major General Hugh Gaffey, the 26th Infantry under Major General Willard Paul, the 80th Infantry under Major General Horace McBride, plus their supporting artillery, engineers, medical and signal units. The tanks and trucks moved day and night. Traffic controllers stood at every crossroads for 48-hour shifts, directing convoys with hooded flashlights. Some Sherman tanks slid off the roads because they did not have proper ice cleats on their tracks. Recovery vehicles hauled them back onto the pavement and sent them on. Fuel trucks passed columns of infantry marching in the ditches. Field kitchens set up in the snow at midnight to feed men who ate standing up and then climbed back into trucks. On the 20th of December, in Versailles, Dwight Eisenhower received official confirmation of a promotion that had been approved by the United States Senate just days earlier. He was now General of the Army, a 5-star general, the 3rd man in American history to hold that rank after George Marshall and Henry Arnold. He put on the 5th star that day quietly in a small ceremony. He was too tired to celebrate. Inside Bastogne, the 20th and 21st of December were days of endurance. German infantry probed the perimeter constantly. The 101st held. Artillery ammunition dropped below emergency levels. McAuliffe walked the lines in his overcoat, spoke to his men in the frozen foxholes, kept his voice steady. He wrote letters that were never sent. He rationed his own cigarettes. Then, at 11:30 in the morning on the 22nd of December, the moment we opened this story with, the 4 German officers walking down the road under a white flag took place. McAuliffe read the ultimatum. He answered with the single word that would become legend, and within 72 hours that word would be printed in banner headlines from Boston to Los Angeles. But the ultimatum revealed something else. It revealed that the Germans, too, were running out of time. They were demanding surrender because they no longer had the strength to force it. They wanted Bastogne on paper because they could not take it in blood. Somewhere at the Third Army headquarters, another kind of preparation was underway. Patton had been thinking, since long before the offensive began, about the weather, about the low cloud that grounded his air support, about the fog that his advancing tanks could not see through. Sometime in the middle of December, exactly what day the records disagree on, he had summoned his chief chaplain to his office. The chaplain was Colonel James Hugh O'Neill. He was 55 years old. He was a Roman Catholic priest from Chicago. He was a career army chaplain and a quietly humorous man. Patton looked at him and asked whether O'Neill had a good prayer for weather. O'Neill later recalled that he did not know how to answer. He said he would look. Patton told him he wanted a prayer. He wanted it printed. He wanted every soldier in the Third Army to carry a copy. On one side, the prayer for clear weather. On the other side, a Christmas greeting from the commanding general. O'Neill went back to his desk and wrote it that afternoon. 250,000 copies were printed by Third Army headquarters. They were distributed to every unit before the 22nd of December. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee, that armed with Thy power we may advance from victory to victory. On the morning of the 23rd of December, an enormous Russian high-pressure system swept across Western Europe. The clouds broke. The sky over Belgium turned brilliant cold blue. Within hours, Ix Tactical Air Command was in the sky. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts. C-47 transport aircraft flying in low over Bastogne, dropping colored parachutes packed with ammunition, medical supplies, food and rounds for the artillery. On that first day of clear weather, roughly 144 tons of supplies fell inside the American perimeter. Men who had gone without food for 2 days ate from tins in the snow. Wounded soldiers received morphine for the first time in a week. Some days later, when Patton next saw O'Neill, he pinned a bronze star on the chaplain's chest and said, in front of his staff, "Chaplain, you're the most popular man in this headquarters. You sure stand in good with the Lord and the soldiers." But the road to Bastogne was still not open. From the 24th through the 26th of December, the 4th Armoured Division under Hugh Gaffey drove north through Belgian villages that would be remembered by the men who fought there for the rest of their lives. Chaumont, Bougainville, Warnach. Combat Command A and Combat Command B struck the German positions frontally and were repulsed. Losses were heavy. German tanks burned in the streets. On Christmas Eve, inside Bastogne, McAuliffe wrote a message to his men that ended with the phrase, "We're giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present." That night, the Luftwaffe bombed the town. A field hospital was hit. Wounded men died in their cots, and in the darkness before dawn on Christmas morning, the Germans launched their final major assault on the perimeter. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division came out of the woods with tanks and infantry, hitting the western sector defended by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The fighting was hand-to-hand. The paratroopers held. The last German tank in the assault was destroyed by a bazooka team at close range as the sun came up. By the morning of the 26th of December, the Germans on the Bastogne perimeter were exhausted. Their infantry was thinned to fragments. Their armor was low on fuel, and from the south, closer than any of them yet realized, a column of American tanks was coming. The afternoon of the 26th of December, 1944. A cold, bright Belgian sky, snow crunching under tank tracks, diesel smoke on the wind. At the head of Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored Division rode a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel from Springfield, Massachusetts. His name was Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr. He was short, he was stocky, he chewed cigars the way other men chewed gum. He commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, and on that afternoon he was running out of patience. For 3 days his battalion had been fighting from village to village against dug-in German infantry and anti-tank guns. His tanks were down to a handful of running vehicles. His men had barely slept. He had received orders that morning to hold his position, consolidate, and wait for infantry support before making any further push toward Bastogne. Abrams looked at his map. He looked at the smoke on the northern horizon, where the Bastogne perimeter was still burning. He said to his executive officer, in a voice that no one who heard it ever forgot, that they were going to Bastogne. He picked a route through the village of Eisenhower. He knew that on the far side of that village lay open ground running north to the American lines. He called for a massive artillery preparation. He ordered his lead tank company to drive straight through the village at full speed without stopping. The lead tank was a Sherman, an M4A3E2 assault variant with extra frontal armor, one of the toughest Shermans ever built. Its name was painted on the side in white letters, Cobra King. Her commander was 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion. He was 28 years old. He was a farm boy from Illinois, and in the early afternoon of the 26th of December, at approximately 3 o'clock, he led 5 Shermans and a half-track full of infantry into a Senoir, while 10 American artillery battalions fired every shell they had on the German positions on either side of the road. The village burst into flame around them. Buildings collapsed. German soldiers fired from cellars and windows. American shells fell so close that Boggess later said he could feel the heat through the tank's armor. But they did not stop. They punched through Assenoir and out the other side into a stretch of quiet farm road running north. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, the light beginning to fade, Boggess saw men in American uniforms in the tree line ahead. He slowed his tank. He climbed out of the turret with his hand on his sidearm. He called across the frozen field. A young lieutenant from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st walked out of the trees. His name was Dwayne Webster. He looked at the Sherman. He looked at Boggess. He said something ordinary. The exact words vary between accounts. In one telling, he simply called out, "Come on out, this is the 4th Armored." In another, he said his name and his unit. Either way, the meaning was the same. The siege was ending. The two men shook hands. A short while later, McAuliffe himself drove out to the edge of his perimeter to meet the tanks of the 4th Armored coming through. He shook Abrams's hand and said, in the plain Washington manner that was his whole life, "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne was broken. The news moved fast. It reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. It reached Bradley in Luxembourg. It reached Eisenhower in Versailles, and for the first time in a week the maps on the wall in the Situation Room seemed to show a story that was not entirely bad. Newspapers in the United States printed the word "nuts" in banner headlines. Photographs of exhausted paratroopers standing beside Sherman tanks appeared on Sunday morning breakfast tables from Boston to Los Angeles. But here is a truth that the newspapers did not know how to tell, and it is a truth that the men who were there never forgot. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the fighting for Bastogne. It was in some ways the beginning of the worst of it. Because in the days that followed the breakthrough, the Germans launched their heaviest attacks yet. Manteuffel had shifted fresh divisions south to close the narrow corridor that Abrams had punched open. He wanted Bastogne back. He knew that if he could seal the town off again, the trap would still spring shut. From the 27th of December through the first week of January, the fighting around Bastogne was in some sectors more brutal than anything the 101st had endured while surrounded. American casualties inside and around Bastogne in that second week exceeded the casualties of the first. Paratroopers who had held the perimeter for a week in freezing foxholes now died in counterattacks against dug-in German positions in the snow. Some of them were killed by artillery, some by machine gun fire, some by the cold itself, curled at the bottom of their holes with frostbitten feet turning black inside their boots. The men who lived through it remembered the second week as worse than the first. Meanwhile, on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, Montgomery had stabilized his front. On the 3rd of January 1945, the two great pincers finally began to close. Hodges's First Army drove south. Patton's Third Army drove north. Between them, a shrinking bubble of German forces fought a savage retreat back through the same snowy roads they had come racing down 4 weeks earlier. The salient the Germans had punched into the American line, the Bulge from which the battle takes its English name, was slowly ground away. On the 25th of January, 1945, the American front stood roughly where it had stood at 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The cost was staggering. American casualties, depending on how they are counted, totaled between 75 and 90,000 men. Roughly 19,000 of them killed, more than 47,000 wounded, some 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest single battle in the history of the United States Army during the Second World War. More Americans fell in the snow of the Ardennes than in any other engagement of the entire European campaign. German casualties are harder to know precisely. Estimates run from 60,000 to more than 100,000, but the raw number of dead and wounded is not the story of the German loss. The story of the German loss is in the tanks. More than 700 German armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned in the Ardennes. Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, King Tigers, the nearly 70-ton behemoths in which so much Nazi hope had been invested, many of them were not destroyed by American fire. They were left in the snow when they ran out of fuel. Their crews walked away and burned them. In the fields around Bastogne, in the forests near St. Vith, in the ditches of villages no American had ever heard of before December, the last strategic armored force of the Third Reich died. And here is a truth that the men who fought there could not yet know, but that history now sees clearly. The German armor lost in the Ardennes was armor that could not be replaced. Every one of those Panther tanks left burning in a Belgian ditch was a tank that would not be defending the Vistula River 6 weeks later. On the 12th of January 1945, less than 3 weeks after Abrams reached Bastogne, the Red Army launched its Vistula-Oder offensive in Poland. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers attacked a German defense that had been hollowed out to feed Hitler's Ardennes gamble. In 3 weeks, the Red Army advanced 300 miles. They reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge, fought and paid for in American blood in the snow of Belgium, helped shorten the war on the Eastern Front as well. The men of the 101st Airborne who died in Bastogne never knew it, but they helped bring the Red Army to the outskirts of Berlin. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered, but before we close the story, we have to say honestly what this battle was and what it was not. Because history has a way of making its heroes too simple and its villains too easy. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by one man. It was not saved by one general. And the popular story, retold for 80 years in books and films, that George Patton alone rescued Bastogne, is a story that flattens the truth into something smaller than what really happened. Anthony McAuliffe and the men of the 101st Airborne Division held Bastogne, on their own, for a full week before any relief column reached them. They held on cold rations and ration shells. They held with wounded men freezing in the corridors of a Belgian seminary. They held because paratroopers, once ordered to hold a piece of ground, are very hard men to move. Colonel Oscar Koch had seen the German build-up before anyone else in the Third Army. Colonel James O'Neill wrote a prayer that 250,000 soldiers carried into battle. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams disobeyed his standing orders to make the final push into the town. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess drove his tank through a burning village, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whatever the American commanders thought of him personally, moved fast on the northern shoulder of the Bulge and stabilized a front that could have crumbled. 2 weeks after the relief of Bastogne, on the 7th of January 1945, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters. He described the battle in language that suggested British forces had rescued the Americans. Bradley was enraged. Eisenhower had to intervene personally to keep the alliance from tearing apart in the newspapers. It was one of the ugliest command disputes of the entire war. Neither man ever fully forgave the other, and there was one more man whose responsibility has often gone unspoken. That man was Omar Bradley. The warnings had reached him, as we saw at the beginning of this story. He had chosen not to act on them. 19,000 American families would receive telegrams because of choices made, in part, in the quiet offices of the American command in early December. Bradley was not a bad general. He was a careful, decent, professional soldier who made a wrong call at a moment when a right call would have saved lives. That, too, is part of the truth. As for the German commanders, they had never believed the offensive could succeed. Rundstedt called it, in private, the offensive of a lunatic. Model told his staff quietly that the plan had no chance. Manteuffel fought his part of the battle with skill and threw his tanks away against a defense that did not break. When it was over, he wrote that his army had been used to buy a few more weeks for a regime already condemned. Which brings us, finally, to Patton. George Patton was not a saint. He was not a modest man. He was not always right. The scandals of Sicily and Knutsford, which we spoke of at the beginning of this story, were only the loudest of many. He had said things about many peoples, in private and in public, that no honorable man would defend today. If you had served under him, you might have loved him or hated him, but you would not have forgotten him. But at Verdun on the 19th of December, in a cold room with a coal stove and a wall map, George Patton did something that very few commanders in the history of warfare have ever done. He looked at an impossible task, and he understood that it was possible because he had already begun to do it. He did not shout, he did not brag. He said a short sentence about 3 divisions and 48 hours, and an army moved. And here is where the story turns one last time, because George Patton did not live to grow old. On the 9th of December 1945, 1 year after the Battle of the Bulge, Patton was riding in a Cadillac staff car on his way to a pheasant hunt near Mannheim, Germany. The war had been over for 7 months. He was scheduled to return to the United States within days. At a railway crossing, the Cadillac collided with an American army truck at low speed. It was not a violent crash. His driver was uninjured. His companion in the back seat was uninjured. But Patton, sitting in an awkward position, had struck his head against a metal frame. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was taken to the American military hospital in Heidelberg. He remained conscious. He knew what had happened to him. He spent 12 days in traction. His wife Beatrice flew in from Boston to be with him. On the 21st of December 1945, an embolism reached his lungs. He died in his sleep. 2 days later, at his own request, he was buried in the American military cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg. Not among generals, not in a place of honor, but in a plain grave among the men of the Third Army who had died in the Ardennes 1 year before. Row after row of white crosses stretched around him, boys from Ohio and Georgia and California, boys from small towns and city streets. He asked to lie among his soldiers, and he does to this day. Dwight Eisenhower survived the war and became the 34th President of the United States. In his memoir Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, he wrote about Patton with a complicated affection. He acknowledged that Patton had been one of the finest battlefield commanders of the war. He acknowledged also that their friendship had never been simple. They had known each other since Camp Meade in 1919. They had watched each other rise. They had watched each other fall and rise again. In the end, Eisenhower described his old friend the way one soldier describes another he had trusted with his life. It was not written to be quoted in headlines. It was written to be understood. Anthony McAuliffe went on to command a division in the Pacific and eventually retired as a 4-star general. He died in 1975 at the age of 77. He never made much of the word nuts. He said more than once that the men of the 101st had done the fighting. He had only said something he might have said any other day. Creighton Abrams became one of the most respected armor officers in the American Army. He commanded American forces in Vietnam. The Army named its next generation of main battle tank after him, the M1 Abrams. Every American armored vehicle that has rolled forward under fire since 1980 carries his name into battle. He died in 1974. He is buried at Arlington. Charles Boggess, the young lieutenant in Cobra King, survived the war, went home to Illinois, worked as a schoolteacher, and lived quietly until his death in 1998. He was 79 years old. His tank sits today in the National Museum of the United States Army in Virginia. Colonel Oscar Koch, the intelligence officer who saw the storm coming when no one else did, retired quietly and wrote a book that almost no one read. He died in 1970. His warnings, delivered 9 days before the German offensive, are now studied at the United States Army War College. Chaplain James O'Neill returned to Chicago after the war and continued to serve as a priest. When asked in later years whether he believed his prayer had truly cleared the skies over Bastogne, he answered carefully. He said only that he had done what a general had asked him to do, and that the weather had done what the weather had done, and that a wise man does not claim credit that belongs to God. Which brings us back to Bastogne, to a small crossroads town in the Ardennes, where 20,000 Americans held a perimeter for a week in the coldest winter anyone could remember. Where a general said the word nuts because he could not think of anything better to say. Where a tank named Cobra King came out of a burning village with the sun going down behind it. where a chaplain wrote a prayer that 250,000 men carried in their pockets, and where the sky opened the next morning as if in answer. None of it was the work of one man. The story you may have heard of a phone call that made Eisenhower cry is a legend that has grown in the retelling over 80 years. The truth is quieter. It was a face-to-face meeting in a cold French barracks. It was a promise made between two old friends who had known each other since Camp Meade in 1919. It was a promise kept in silence and carried by both men until the end of their lives, and in its own way, that truth is more powerful than any legend. But if George Patton had not sat in that cold barracks in Verdun on the 19th of December, and if he had not already, days earlier, quietly telephoned his headquarters and started the wheels turning, and if he had not looked at Dwight Eisenhower and said, calmly, that he could attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions, then this story would have ended very differently. It would have ended with columns of American prisoners marching east into captivity. It would have ended with German tanks on the Meuse River. It would have ended with a war in Europe that lasted longer and cost more and left more empty chairs at more American dinner tables. It ended, instead, with a single word from a tired artillery general, and with a promise made and kept by a man with ivory-handled revolvers, and with a young tank commander named Boggess shaking hands with a young engineer named Webster in a Belgian tree line at 4:50 in the afternoon on the 26th of December 1944. If your father served in that winter, if your uncle carried that prayer in his coat pocket, if your neighbor came home from Bastogne and never spoke about it, take a moment tonight, wherever you are watching, and say his name out loud, because history is not written only in books. It lives in memory, and it lives as long as we still remember to speak the names. Thank you for watching.